Hello, my name is Everett Parker, and this is my YouTube speech for the consensus versus minority view on climate change. So to get us started, for the consensus view is a direct temperatures measured all the way back to the 1880s. And over a century, there is a rise of 1.5 degrees. So my first chart I'm going to show you is right 1880s, around present day, and you see this carbon dioxide emissions, and it's generally low. Temperatures are low, spikes up for war because there's a lot of manufacturing going on, and as CO2 emissions and concentration goes up, it rises with temperature 1.5 degrees. So it's a general trend going upwards around the 70s, and that's really where all the emissions started coming, because like cars, factories, and it just makes sense. My second point for the consensus is the Venus atmosphere. It is 97% carbon dioxide. Now think about it. It's the second planet away from the sun, so it shouldn't be the hottest. Mercury should be hotter. But Venus has an average atmosphere temperature of 900 degrees, while Mercury only has an average temperature of 800 degrees. And there's only one really explanation for that, is the atmosphere composition. And like I said, the atmosphere composition is 97% carbon dioxide. That just kind of shows that CO2 to the consensus is a control knob. The more CO2 you put in, the hotter you're getting. So the third point I want to mention is climate models. So climate models are fairly accurate in describing what ought to be. They're usually tested against the past and the present to make sure, they have to use it against data to see if the data is accurate. So I want to show you my second model. So the black line is like actual weather, climate events. The red is with man-made CO2 emissions involved as a factor. The blue is without CO2 emissions as a factor. And if you see, the red line goes up, so does the black line. It just kind of overlaps with each other. It's not the exact same, but it overlaps with each other. The blue, however, without CO2 emissions, just kind of falls flat. It doesn't go with the data. So it's actually pretty complicated to do these, but they're showing to be accurate enough to further the scientists' research into it, trying to make them more accurate so we can predict what's going to go on in the future. Now, for the minority, it's completely different. The first thing I want to say is the composition of our Earth's atmosphere. So 77% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen, and 1 to 2% other gases are hydrogen, argon, neon, helium. And in those inside bitty 1 to 2% is the 0.04% of man-made carbon dioxide. Now, that kind of puts a halt to the consensus for the minority. If CO2 is such a driving factor in our climate change, why is there so little of it in our climate? So that opens up the question, instead of just going straight for the CO2 emissions. It is the thing that's causing everything. It says there's ought to be other factors. It's not just man-made. We're seeing if it was just man-made CO2, then it's so little of it, if you're basically giving us a doomsday crisis. If that little bit of CO2 is killing us, then who knows what's going to happen in the next few centuries. So there's a temperature offset for the minority view that they want to point out. There's a temperature offset. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that there is 800 to 1,000 year gap is a small, tiny gap. The red is the temperature and the black is the CO2. They want to point out that if the CO2 is the control knob, then why is the temperature not rising with it instead of lagging behind it, or lagging behind it? Another thing right here, boom, CO2 is pretty low, temperature is way higher. That kind of just doesn't make sense if CO2 was a control knob. So it has to be other factors. So if you actually look at it the way I looked at it at first, it almost looks like temperatures are actually making CO2 rise higher. Now, that doesn't make sense, obviously, but it almost looks like that, the way it's lagging behind. And there's just almost a 1,000 year gap between the two, like I said. So another persuasive argument for the minority view is the medieval warming period. A period of time where there was no man-made CO2 emissions, none at all. And look how hot it got. And how can you explain it? That's my question, is how can you explain it? So if it got so warm during the 800 to 1200 AD time area, and there was no carbon emissions man-made wise, then why did it get so warm? There has to be other factors, and that is a minority viewpoint, is that they're not denying CO2 emissions by man are affecting climate. They're not denying that. But they're saying that that is just only one factor of the bigger picture. The consensus is saying that is the bigger picture, is that man-made. I hope that my explanations of the 6 points I showed you, 3 for the consensus, 3 for the minority, helped enlighten you, and I hope you have a good one.